Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy. But America's agriculture landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertising campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. From the producers who make your food to the store where you buy the final product and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Fire has long played an important role on the Great Plains. Land managers need to understand the history of fire in order to make decisions to keep the grasslands healthy and thriving. We will take a look at the practice of controlled or prescribed burning as we go on a burn in Sun City, as well as speak to some of the people on and in charge of the burn on this episode of Real Ag. Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
Fires are an integral part of the land, influencing species diversity, ecosystem services such as nutrient cycles and decomposition, and the humans that inhabit and protect these places. Land managers need to understand fire regimes to successfully manage their lands, for neglect could have more devastating consequences. So how do land managers properly integrate a cycle of land burning to help with the natural cycle of life on their land through the use of fire or controlled burning? So what is controlled burning?
Controlled burning, and a lot of times we actually prefer to call it prescribed burning, controlled, yes, hopefully we control the fire in terms of the area that we actually want to burn. And we distinguish that from a wildfire that, those occur naturally. We haven't had any, I guess, here this year, but a couple of years ago we had some extensive wildfires that occur under very extreme environmental conditions. And a controlled burn or a prescribed burn, or we pick the days, the weather conditions under which we want to do those burns. So we have certain, wind speeds, temperature, humidity in particular that we select to do a controlled burn. And usually with that controlled burn, the other major thing is we need to have an objective in mind. Why are we going to burn?
We burn with a written plan that has objectives, and you burn to meet those objectives. We don't burn just for the fun of it. We have a plan and we have something we want to accomplish, whether that's to increase production or to get rid of cedar trees. There are all kinds of different brush. So there's a reason to burn, and we call it a prescribed burn.
You get into other areas of the state and there's other things to consider. There's economics. You can use prescribed fire to improve the rate of gain on young stocker cattle. You can use fire to control grazing distribution or improve grazing distribution. You can use fire to improve wildlife habitat in the case of creating other habitats for upland birds, for example, nesting and rooting cover and that type of thing.
Probably a good symptom in Kansas, though, and in many places in the Great Plains is maybe the amount of woody plants that are actually out there. And eastern red cedar is one that we deal with throughout the state. And as long as those cedars aren't too big, we can get them with fire about any time. But if they get really large, well, then we might have to rely on some other techniques. But I would probably start looking at woody plants, and because if we don't burn, and particularly here, let's say in eastern Kansas where we get 30 plus inches of rain, 35, 40 years, we can go from a grassland to a forest. So if you have a considerable amount of woody plants, it's probably a sign that it hasn't been burned. And if we want to maintain it as prairie, we need to probably reinstitute that practice. And we've had a long history of fire in Kansas, particularly the Flint Hills area. There are people, when they started bringing cattle, probably back in almost during the trail days when they're bringing cattle out of Texas, they found pretty quickly that fire would enhance livestock gain. So we've had over 100 years of history. Here at Kansas State University, I think there was projects that started with time of burning. It's 100 years ago, 1918. So a long history. We continue to look at it. There are still places in Kansas where fire is probably not being used as frequently as it should. And I think people that live in the western half of the state are figuring out we're going to have to start using prescribed fire. It's a tool. Like some people don't think it's a tool, but I call it a tool, that we can use to manage the land. And so we need to think about its use and where we can do it safely. I guess another issue I hadn't mentioned is those conditions under which we burn. We usually don't worry about soil moisture too much here, and in 2019 we don't have any drought conditions in the state of Kansas. We've got good soil moisture. But as we go west, soil moisture does become more important, because when you do burn, you'd like to have moisture there so those plants start growth fairly quickly and get the ground covered back up.
The grassland evolved with fire as being a part of that system. Prior to European settlement, fires came across this country all the time at various times during the year. And so the grassland itself evolved with that being an element. So to say it should never be burned, no, I think it should be burned. It's just a matter of safety and whether you can control things, keep it contained.
If you get those windy, gusty days with low humidities, and it doesn't take much of a spark to get a fire started. But preventing that from happening, preventing wildfires is pretty difficult. But if you haven't burned periodically, you're going to have more fuel there that makes it more difficult to control. Generally, then we get this buildup of fuel to the point when we do have a wildfire, we've got very catastrophic situations where it's very difficult to control those fires. So sometimes that can be another reason for burning, is just to reduce the hazards associated with a wildfire.
We have seen in the last few years what has happened with wildfires. And with a wildfire, if you have a lot of prominent eastern cedars that are in canyons and on the uplands, they just perpetuate a wildfire because of their flammability. They explode. The embers are carried on with a tremendous amount of, if you have a wind, and so it just feeds it, and it's almost impossible to stop. And so, getting rid of those types of woody plants is critically important in our area.
There's a lot of people smarter than me that have looked at fire before, we came on the landscape and started influencing the timing of the fire. And you can go into Florida and Texas, it burned almost every year. In this part of Kansas, it burned anywhere from every 3 to 5 to 6 years. That was the normal interval between burns. A lot of it depended on your rainfall. You go out further west, there's less rainfall, there's less material there to carry a fire, so they naturally happened less often. There's places in the United States that didn't have a fire once every 200 years. So it depends on rainfall, how much you should burn. No one should burn every year. It's not good for anything. Too much of a fire is just as bad as not enough fire.
And I think it depends on where you're starting from. I think there are areas, and there have been a lot of studies done. The Kanza Prairies looked at burning frequency, and basically will say that probably more, at least here in eastern Kansas, probably somewhere less than every 3 years. And again, like I said, it kind of depends on where you're starting from. If there's woody plants out there, typically we would recommend people burn probably as late as they can in the spring, 2 or 3 years in a row, and then maybe lay off. If it's pretty much grassland as it is, burning every other year probably will maintain it. As we get to drier regions, the western part of the state, the burn frequency, they still have woody plants invading. It's just been a slower process. But maybe every 5 to 10 years might be frequent enough. So again, depends on where you're at. But here, where we get high rainfall here in the eastern part of Kansas, if we don't burn, we get quite a buildup of mulch very quickly. And that's bad. It starts choking out the better grasses, allows woody plants to invade. And so fire frequency here needs to be pretty frequent, maybe 2 or 3 years out of 5.
Kansas's wetlands and prairies are ideal natural communities for prescribed burning. Fire helps manage weeds and other growth, helping to reduce the risk of wildfires. At the same time, it restores nutrients and leads to more desirable growth. But with all these benefits of prescribed burning, when would it not be a good idea to burn?
Well, anytime the wind's too fast, it just makes it dangerous. And anytime you don't have enough wind, a light and variable is one of the worst times to burn, because as that fire creates heat, it will create its own wind. And the most important thing in a fire is predicting the wind direction and the wind speed. It will control where your fire goes. So light and variable is don't light it up.
That there's occasions when if you don't have enough manpower, you don't have enough equipment, or your site is not well enough prepared that you can assure control, then I would say yes, that's a time when you do not want to do a prescribed burn. To set up a prescribed burn, you really need to have a good plan in mind, or a written plan. We prefer a written plan. And you need to look at all the aspects of control and safety. Primarily, safety is people first, property second. And so you want to guard against any issues that might create hazards for either one of those. But you need to have secure boundaries around the area you want to burn. We call them fire breaks. There's a variety of different fire breaks out there. You can use mowed fire breaks, tilled fire breaks, dozed fire breaks. We use a lot of natural fire breaks, such as roads, sometimes stream channels provide a good fire break. But we try and surround the area that we intend to burn with a good, solid fire break of some type. And all this usually is described in the prescribed burn plan.
You know, what is their prescription? You know, and we can talk about those sort of things in terms of wind speeds. Generally, we don't want wind speeds over 15 miles an hour, for instance, because fires are more difficult to control if it's too windy. Temperature can play a factor, but 40 to 70 degrees, and humidity is about the same, relative humidity, about 40 to 70%. So that is part of the burn plan, is that prescription conditions under which you're going to burn. Another important part of that burn plan is actually having a map of the pasture that you're going to burn. On there, you're going to note lots of different things. Probably going to select a wind direction you would like to burn out of. And from that, then you determine, okay, where are my fire guards or fire breaks going to be? Those are going to be on the downwind side, and you select the wind direction and you burn that direction. How are you going to ignite the fire? Hazards and precautions in the areas. Knowing where the gates are at, for instance, is pretty important so people can get in and out. And if there are, like say, certain hazards in the pasture, old fence lines, lots of different things that could be problem areas. Should have safe zones if something goes wrong where people can escape to. So that's all part of that burn plan.
We utilize the Prescribed Burn Council. Jess Crockford was involved with that, and he's the one that put the fire plan together, the burn plan, and very detailed. Had the description of the area, the vegetation that was there, the direction of wind that we needed for burning, and the removal of the trees, the fire breaks where they would go. The burn plan had the location of where the fire trucks were going to be, where supplemental water would be, and where it would start, and how we would end it, and it was very complete. It also included who we needed to contact, the emergency personnel around, the neighbors, and so that everybody was informed, so there are no surprises in the community. My fire boss, I utilized Keith Yearout, and he and his wife, they pretty well put the email out and notified other ranchers and people around that would be willing to help, volunteer to help. And so it considerable amount of preparation, planning, In fact, there were several days was involved in preparation, and the burn only lasted about a half a day with the crew there. But it actually took several days and actually weeks in preparation to get it ready.
That's an important part of it, you know. And again, that burn boss, sometimes you get your crew together and you decide something's just not right. You know, it's off a prescription. Well, maybe we shouldn't burn today. So you got to make that decision. I guess, you know, I mentioned before those hazards that could occur. Those should be noted on your map. Yeah, your ignition plan. That goes back to, again, where your backfires are going to occur, where you're going to light your head fire. So that's all information that should be on that burn plan. And those, you know, there are templates available that walk you right through those. And a number of people can help in writing burn plans if you give them enough time to do it.
You need to have cooperating neighbors, number one. But the easiest way for us is, for instance, my wife and I have very little equipment. So we joined our Gyp Hills Prescribed Burn Association. And in that association was a number of members, fellow ranchers, neighbors, that had the fire equipment that we could utilize and prescribe burning on our ranch. And so just simply joining the association puts us in contact with people that have the equipment, with ranchers that have the equipment. And so you pool resources, and together you conduct a successful prescribed burn. So it's neighbor helping neighbor.
Well, two things, you know, again, if they need help with the burn plan themselves, if they aren't familiar with doing it, they may be able to contact. There's people like myself or maybe some other people in Extension that have some experience working with burns and could help them with a burn plan. The other organization, though, that has rangeland management specialists that will help write burn plans is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. They have 8 or 10 people, I think, in the state of Kansas that are willing to work with landowners and write burn plans. Again, whomever you get to do that, give them enough time. You know, if you need to burn tomorrow, you need to give them months of it would be better than, you know, shorter term. So that's one way. The other thing is although they're getting fewer and fewer, there are people in the state or companies that will do contract burning, where you can hire people to do it for you. But again, it seems like we're getting less and less of them, but there's some still out there. Where we try to keep a list is the Kansas Forest Service on their website has a place where you can find burn contractors. And I think there's 8 or 10 of them listed there. Some of those are from the state of Kansas. There's some from out of state that do it as well. But, and then you can always check, you know, maybe check with the local county extension office and or the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they may know individuals fairly close that do it on a contract basis. I think it's a good idea, of course, to always notify your neighbors that you're planning to burn. I don't know whether they necessarily need your burn plan, but it doesn't hurt for them to have it. If you have a crew of, you know, and one of the problems that we get into with prescribed burning is sometimes we don't have enough people involved or we don't have the right equipment. But every person that's helping with the burn ought to have your plan. And generally before you light that fire, you go over that plan, you know, and answer any questions that they might have. But and again, I think I mentioned that if I could, I would leave a burn plan with the fire department, or in some counties it might be the emergency management office. Whoever, one of the requirements in the state of Kansas is notification if you're planning to burn. Well, whoever you have to notify, that would be a good place to have a burn plan as well.
Fire is one of many natural disturbances that has shaped landscapes for as long as vegetation has been present on Earth. Approximately 8 million lightning strikes occur globally each day, and lightning starts more than 6,000 fires in the United States each year. The presence or absence of fire plays an important role in virtually all terrestrial ecosystems. The Nature Conservancy identified 3 broad ecosystem categories based on the natural occurrences of fire and vegetation response: fire-dependent, fire-sensitive, and fire-independent ecosystems. Much of Kansas is a fire-dependent ecosystem where fire is essential. Climate conditions provide ample wetting and drying to promote growth of flammable vegetation for fuel. Many plant species possess traits that respond positively to fire and may facilitate the fire's spread.
Typically, we'd like to see wind speed maybe 5 to 15 miles an hour. You don't want it too windy, but you don't want light variable winds either because it's unpredictable where the fire is going to go. So that's 5 to 15 miles an hour. The temperature, temperatures that we're comfortable working in, you don't want it to get too cold. I usually use maybe 40 degrees as a minimum, but 40 to 70. As it gets warmer, it gets 80, 85 degrees. Again, that fire burns through places where you might not expect it to go, so you have to be aware of that. But something that kind of moderate air temperatures, and then relative humidity. Again, I use 40 to 70%. That's usually not a big issue here in eastern Kansas. As you go west, though, sometimes the humidities are apt to be lower, and but you start dropping 35, 30% humidity. Again, your chances for spot fires, those embers flowing in the air and starting a new fire, increase dramatically. But those are the three main things. And then we can look at mixing height at 18,000 or 1,800 feet above the ground. Something we can look at it as well. With that, then again, because of the smoke, wind direction, I think, is also important. And sometimes, if you have that highway or you're near a city, and you try to pick a day when the wind's not blowing that direction, so you don't put smoke there. You don't need to burn necessarily on a specific day. You may have a target. I always like to tell people, give yourself a window of opportunity. Maybe a 10, 14-day period that you can burn that's going to accomplish the goals that you want to want to accomplish, and then pick the right day during that. When that conditions occur, go ahead and proceed. It doesn't have to be on a specific date necessarily.
We use quite a lot of different varieties of techniques, if you will, to burn. Our kind of our go-to method that we use, we call it a ring fire. We use two teams to start on the downwind side. We go as far downwind on the property that we tend to burn, and we start what we call backfires and let those fires work into the wind as far as we feel necessary to be safe. And once those fires have been established, then we work up the sides. On the backfires, we like to see those be about 100 feet wide before we start up the sides, and we call that the flank fires. And then we work up both sides until we get to the very upwind side of the property. And then we close that circle by bringing the teams around and join them up. And that creates the head fire side that burns out the center part of the burn. That's just one technique we use. We have used what we call strip fires, where we just have a lot of torches that we just work into the wind and let those fires flank out going across the wind. This is a little calmer fire. You can use a backfire to burn the entire thing. It's a more consuming fire. It consumes about everything that's out there that's able to burn, and it's not necessarily intense, but it's a little more aggressive in terms of burning into the soil and maybe doing damage to plants. So we try to keep those to a minimum. But
It's the way you light the fire. I mean, people can burn with a cow trail, use that as the black line. You can't put much of a head fire into it. You have to strip it out. So that's the techniques of lighting are how you control it. If you have 5,000 pounds of fuel out there, it takes longer to make your black line than if you have 500 pounds out there. So lighting technique is vitally important on controlling a prescribed fire.
Sometimes we'll get little spot fires that, some ember or whatever floats across our fire guard, gets into some adjacent areas, and we may get a little spot fire started. And again, if you have the manpower and equipment, you may be able to handle that yourself. You just put people on that to put it out. Other times, if it's depends on maybe how much vegetation there is. If it's something that's going to get away fairly quickly, one needs to make the call and get some help from a local fire department. I think it's always a good idea when you have that, making your burn plan, is you have what we call contingencies. You know, what are you going to do if such and such happens? And the burn boss, who's in charge of the burn, usually has got to make that decision. That's probably one of the tougher decisions they got to make. If it's got away from us, we need help. And if you can give your local fire department your burn plan ahead of time, including that map so they know exactly where you're at or where the gates are at, then they're going to be a lot better shape if they have to come out and respond.
From writing up a burn plan to contacting the local authorities, there are many things to get done to prepare for a prescribed burn. But when the burn day comes around, who is in charge of the burn and who lights the initial fire?
We like to make sure in every prescribed burn that we have a burn boss. And that person is somebody that's very experienced, that knows what's going on. And he has the power, I don't know if that's an appropriate word, but has the ability to call off a burn. If wind gets too high or humidity gets too low, if things just aren't going right, the wind's changing directions, he can shut it down. He has the responsibility to make sure, to the best of his ability, that the burn will go safely and according to plan. And so we use a burn boss, and that may be the landowner. Most of the time it probably isn't.
We have the landowner light the fire because of liability issues. The landowner is the one that has the liability coverage for his property, and he will be the one that initiates the fire.
From grassland to wetland, prescribed burning can be a valuable tool in the land manager's arsenal, and if used properly, can help bring greater yields, as well as keeping the land from becoming a possible hazard for wildfires. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Real Ag on prescribed burning. As always, you can check out this and other episodes of Real Ag by going to shptv.org. From the producers at Smoky Hills Public Television, this has been Real Ag. Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.